Good afternoon. My name is David Hecht, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia in a program entitled Integrative Conservation and Anthropology. I finalized my ethnographic field research in Bhutan at the end of 2020, and I'm currently working on my dissertation. I will be sharing some of the details of one of the chapters of my dissertation in this presentation, wherein I'll be highlighting the integral nature of maps and mapping in our collaborative research. Primarily, I will be focusing on our efforts to foreground local knowledge of cultural landscapes in the context of conservation and development praxis in the Kingdom of Bhutan. In doing so, I aim to demonstrate the capacity of participatory mapping methods to counter dominant spatial productions of conservation landscapes and thereby challenge categorizations of our environment, not as resources for extraction, but rather lived interdependencies of our more than human world. Before I begin, some brief acknowledgement and gratitude for my collaborators at the Royal Society for Protection of Nature and the funding agencies that supported and are supporting this work. I also want to quickly orient everybody geographically to Bhutan here in the Eastern Himalayas, south of Tibet and north of India. Over more than 3 years, the goal of our research was to collaborate with community partners in Bhutan's conservation protected areas to better understand the cultural landscapes that underscore these ecologically invaluable places. The collaborative and participatory nature of our research prioritized local voices and traditions and facilitated a space to share biocultural knowledge and ensure that they are included and indeed put on the map, not as ecological or cultural resources, but instead expressions of relationships, stories, and places, interdependent rituals and cultural traditions. And the more we asked our community partners to mark important biocultural relationships on the map, the more stories emerged of powerful, yet frequently invisible, more than human actors, namely place-based local deities and spirits that reside within the landscape and inevitably intersect with local conservation and development politics in the kingdom. Although my research covers a lot of ground, that is really my starting point. And while there are many religious expressions in Bhutan, it is pre-Buddhist belief systems, so indigenous animism or Bonche, that has been historically fortified by Tibetan Buddhism and its rituals, such as the Sirkim you see here, and it's so deeply enmeshed in the Bhutanese landscape. In this religious context, local deities and more than human spirits occupy territory on the landscape in forests and cliffs, rocks, lakes, and springs, and frequently old-growth trees, such as this giant cypress here in the photo. This is the abode of a local deity, and libations are made to appease them and maintain positive relations, to prevent illness in the community, and to ensure good harvests and healthy livestock. These gods of the territory and settlement go by many different names, but generally are referred to as Yulajida or Nedajida, and their geographic territories, or habitats if you will, are described as the deity's palace or citadel of the deity, or pojang. Generally in these areas, one is not allowed to cut trees or pollute the area physically or spiritually, and many of these areas have thus been protected from exploitation or degradation, indeed safeguarded by local communities, and frequently considered prior to any development projects, such as the building of a house, a school, or a road. Many of the questions that emerged in my research were geographic and spatial questions in nature. Curious how these more than human relationships are negotiated and how they interface with ongoing efforts to politically conserve and protect landscapes for conservation purposes. So today, my second research question is perhaps most relevant. I ask, how do local communities spatially negotiate the diversity of types of protected spaces and places, and conceptualize the overlap, or not, of Nedajida with conservation protected areas for focal species? I used many different methods to approach these questions, and participatory mapping addressed these political and spatial questions in very illuminating ways. Now, broadly defined, participatory mapping is used to represent the spatial knowledge of local communities, and it can take many different forms. So in our circumstances, it was sketch mapping and scale mapping that were most useful, through collaborative mapping, counter mapping, and web mapping. So for instance, we use sketch mapping and sketch maps to have conversations with local partners about their communities and to let them detail what was important, what was changing, what concerns or objectives they had in regards to projects in their vicinity. In these co-produced maps, interlocutors not only drew significant buildings and villages, temples and schools, but also important ecological features like the surrounding hillside forests and central wetland complex in this particular map that is now an internationally recognized and protected Ramsar site. And if you zoomed into the sketch map at the top, you would see the names of local deities written on the mountainside, so Yulajida and Nedajida classes, whose hillside territories surround this particular high altitude wetland complex. And we use sketch mapping methods frequently. They illuminated local perspectives on the geographical and cultural relationships between communities and local deities, of which there are many. And we learned that just like humans' relationship with wildlife and other local ecologies, community relationships with local deities need to be cultivated, tended, and cared for through annual rituals and ceremonies, as well as the enforcement of social and communal rules, such as not cutting down trees within the deity's territory or entering during the wrong time of year. And sketch mapping methodologies illuminated some of these rich biocultural interdependencies. And it was more of a free-form method for individuals to create maps on their own terms with some of their own rules. We also employed other participatory mapping methodologies that benefited group conversations, such as this printed scale map, to sit in a group and describe places and relationships at the landscape and watershed level. And this was highly effective for understanding the territorial and spatial nature of deities and their proximity to some of these protected areas. It also allowed community members to discuss with one another their shared experience and knowledge. This process allowed us to have cross-generational conversations, which is important in this context, as evidence suggests much of this knowledge is not passed down to the next generation. Indeed, the process of mapping was oftentimes more illuminating than the end product, as the spatial negotiations that occurred in consultation across generations and gender, occupations, illuminated co-constituting cultural realities and some of these more than human ecologies at play in these significant areas. While these maps illuminated frequently marginalized viewpoints and perspectives of local community members involved in some of these collaborative programs, they still remain flat. One could argue that they are conditioned and inanimate coded data points that could be uploaded as points and polygons in a GIS. And that was my intellectual instinct as a Western-trained social scientist. Orange data tags for place names and toponyms, yellow data tags for local deities, non-human spirits. And the resulting maps, like all maps, would of course and are unrepresentative of the lived phenomenological worlds of our research partners, and in this case, couldn't possibly relay the complex world of unseen beings that share these conservation protected areas, territorial deities that have their own diversities, Nedajida, Yulajida, Tsen, Lu, and Nepo. Moreover, it is well known that you can scarcely step a foot anywhere in the country and not find a storied landscape replete with a cast of local deities and spirits, sacred sites, and other important historic areas. So challenging the very idea of what a map is could get us a little closer to that ideal, asking what would a map look like that stretched the built-in Western cartographic rules or assumptions inherent in a topographic map, for instance. How could maps that we created together with local communities counter these forces that seek to map local environments as a collection of resources? Could we intentionally animate landscapes of the unseen through the animacy of art and artistic expression? During my field season, I formed a partnership with one of Bhutan's most well-known traditional contemporary artists, Mr. Gyempo Wangchuk, to paint a series of maps that foregrounded traditional knowledge and illuminate the cultural and conservation landscapes of deity citadels in this traditional style of tanka and debris, religious Bhutanese art forms. Since the idea has attained widespread support since then, and elders communicated its importance as a way of documenting traditional ecological knowledge of these places and territories for the next generation. And the process of community mapping illuminated that we could map hundreds of local deities and non-human spirits in this place alone, some known by name, others known only by their ecological markers. Creators of this particular map highlighted the most powerful and significant deities found in the area and appeased during community annual rituals. They are gestured to by name here and in the blue circles surrounding the Central Valley, another nationally protected high-altitude wetland complex. Here is a 3D version of that same map, brought into a GIS, limited as it may be, to bring out the topography of these flat spaces. And together with Gyempo and his apprentices, we drew from the perspectives, oral literature, and ethnographic data of our collaborative mapping series and constructed a map that was geographically accurate, down to every stream, river valley, slope and aspect of every hillside, and every old growth forest and watershed. And we projected it onto the canvas. The result being a biocultural map that could be rendered in a GIS, but also transformed into a richly detailed painted map in the style of Bhutanese and Tibetan art. This animate biocultural map highlights places of conservation significance alongside known local deities in their protected territories. It is a map that both challenges conventional Western cartographies and illuminates these invaluable more than human relationships within community and conservation landscapes. With support from our partners, we will be completing a series of 5 maps in areas of ecological and conservation significance. So in conclusion, as ethnobiologists, if we endeavor to be inclusive knowledge holders and weavers and think critically about the diversity of ways to decolonize our knowledge and our maps in this case, then our work can benefit partnering communities and their traditions, as well as the homes of human, non-human, and more than human actors within them. Moreover, our collaborative research methodologies can endeavor to push disciplinary and epistemic boundaries to be more inclusive and equitable, while challenging dominant academic paradigms in productive ways. Thank you so much.